I remember the exact moment I realized my life had turned into a script I no longer recognized. My name is Marina, 42 years old, married for 16 years, to a man I once believed was my closest friend and partner in every adventure. His name is James. We have a small house in the suburbs, the kind with a neat lawn and a mailbox painted pale blue. We used to think this home would be our fortress, where we would build our best memories, host barbecues with neighbors, and drift into comfortable old age together. I met James in college when we both volunteered for a community arts festival. He was kind, funny, and passionate about music. I was enthralled by his carefree spirit, a trait I lacked. We married soon after graduation, believing we had all the time in the world to grow into the people we wanted to be. Over the years, we both found decent jobs. I became an administrative coordinator at a small nonprofit, while James shifted from his love of guitar performance into a more stable role at a software startup. We paid bills on time, made a weekly grocery list, and adopted a rescue dog named Tippy. From the outside, it looked like we had it all under control. But inside our neat routines, a sort of hush had settled. We rarely fought. There was no overt bitterness or dramatic arguments. Yet, it felt as though our relationship had ground down to a routine of polite small talk and synchronized checklists. We scheduled our entire existence: who would pick up the dry cleaning, who would drive Tippy to the vet, which day we'd visit my mother. After so many years, the spark that once defined us had been buried under piles of obligations. I remember lying in bed at night, listening to James snore lightly, wondering if this was simply the natural outcome of a long marriage, or if I was slowly suffocating in the silence we'd created. That was my emotional state when Felix entered my life. At first, I saw him only in passing, an acquaintance who occasionally visited our nonprofit office to consult on technology projects. He was 39, maybe a few years younger than me, always polite, with a calm presence and a knack for unraveling the tech tangles that stumped us. I didn't pay him much attention beyond mild relief that he knew how to fix our outdated computers. Then one afternoon, my boss asked if I'd oversee a new partnership initiative with Felix's consulting firm. I groaned inwardly at the extra workload, but smiled and agreed. The next day, Felix and I ended up in a cramped office storage room sorting through old network cables and mislabeled boxes. We had to assess which items could be donated or recycled. It was tedious work, but I found his humor and easygoing nature made the time glide by. We talked about everything except computers, favorite films, recent books we'd read, his love for hiking in the nearby mountains, how I'd wanted to take a pottery class but never found the courage. He joked that pottery was just as tough as coding. Both required patience and a tolerance for error. By the time we finished, I realized I'd laughed more in those 2 hours than I had in weeks. Still, I told myself this was just a pleasant work connection. He was simply more personable than most consultants, which made the project less painful. But as the weeks passed, Felix's visits became more frequent. We'd chat about nonprofit databases, then drift into personal anecdotes. I learned that he was divorced, had moved to the area recently, and was adjusting to living in a new city. Sometimes we grabbed a quick lunch between meetings, discovering we both loved spicy Thai food. After one such lunch, I noticed a subtle thrill running through me on the drive home, an anticipation of seeing him again. My chest constricted with guilt. I was a married woman who took her vows seriously. Yet I couldn't deny a faint flutter whenever he walked into the office or texted me updates about the project. I tried to refocus on James, on our life together, but every attempt to reignite conversation ended in the same polite hush. We'd watch television, maybe comment on the storyline, then drift into separate corners of the living room. He'd check emails on his phone. I'd read half a page of a book before my mind wandered. The difference between James and Felix grew more pronounced in my eyes, though I felt terrible for comparing them. Felix was curious, always asking about my day, my thoughts, my wishes. Even the littlest details seemed to matter to him. James, meanwhile, remained locked in a routine that left little room for novelty. One evening, I stayed late at the office to help Felix finalize a data migration plan. Everyone else had gone home, leaving only the security guard at the front lobby. We sat side by side in the quiet gloom of the main conference room, laptops open, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Our voices were hushed, resonating through the vacant halls. At one point, I typed a note, only to feel his gaze on me. I looked up, found him studying me with an intensity I hadn't experienced in years. Heat rushed to my cheeks. Clearing my throat, I tried to ask a question about the server timeline, but the words came out stilted. He answered gently, not looking away. That moment crackled, as if we both recognized something crossing from camaraderie into dangerous territory. My heart thudded, a mix of excitement and panic. After we finished, he walked me out to the parking lot. The night air felt thick with unspoken tension. I fiddled with my keys, unsure if I was about to say goodnight or something more. Finally, he broke the silence. "Marina," he murmured, voice low, "I just want to say, I really value working with you. It's rare to find someone who gets me, both professionally and personally." I knew I should respond with a polite acknowledgement. Instead, my mouth said, "Me too," and my eyes welled up unexpectedly. I blinked hard, mortified by the tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not entirely sure what I was apologizing for, maybe for how vulnerable I felt, or for the unspoken longing that had crept between us. Felix, looking concerned, lightly touched my shoulder. We stood there in the glow of the street lamp, too close for mere co-workers. But before either of us acted on the current, I backed away, stammering something about being tired. I drove home, unsettled by how alive and guilty I felt simultaneously. The following weekend, James suggested we have a date night. He said we should try that new Italian place downtown, the one all our neighbors were raving about. I agreed enthusiastically, hoping it might ease the tension inside me. We dressed up a little, something we hadn't done in ages, and the meal was pleasant enough, fresh pasta, good wine. But after half an hour of superficial chatter about local news and his new office reorganization, we lapsed into an awkward silence. I tried to ask him how he felt about our future goals, maybe traveling or finding a hobby we could share. He shrugged, saying he was too swamped to think about that right now. My heart sank. I realized we'd grown so far apart that bridging the gap felt Herculean. We parted that night with polite kisses on the cheek, like acquaintances. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, acutely aware that something in me was drifting outside the bounds of our marriage. When I returned to work on Monday, Felix and I had to coordinate a staff training. We set up an internal chat group, exchanged documents, and ended up texting on and off about random details. The more I conversed with him, the less I could ignore how naturally our conversations flowed. At lunch, we grabbed a sandwich from a nearby deli. We snagged a quiet booth, intending to discuss training schedules, but ended up trading personal stories. He told me about the day he realized his ex-wife had fallen out of love with him, how he dreaded coming home to an empty apartment now. I found my eyes brimming with compassion, echoing his sense of loss. It was dangerous, these confessions we offered each other. They forged a closeness that felt deeper than any emotional link I currently shared with James. I told Felix that my marriage was stagnating, that I felt I was living in a half-lit room, waiting for real warmth or conversation that never came. He listened intently. Then his hand drifted across the table, stopping just shy of touching mine. We hovered like that for a moment, breath caught, until I withdrew. The ache in my chest was almost painful. After that lunch, the unspoken line between us felt razor thin. Neither of us had declared a desire, but it permeated every glance, every hushed conversation. I went home to James with my guilt pressing down like a physical weight. I tried to be extra loving, cooking his favorite meal, asking about his day. He responded kindly, but remained locked behind his routine politeness. That night he fell asleep early, and I sat up, restless. My phone buzzed with a text from Felix. Can't sleep either? My stomach lurched. I knew I shouldn't respond, but I typed back anyway. Yeah, feels like I can't quiet my thoughts. A few more messages passed, mostly about the day's stress. Then he wrote, wish I could talk to you in person right now. My heart hammered. I typed nothing, letting that message hang. He didn't push. I closed my phone, burying my face in my hands, drowning in confusion. The tipping point came when we organized a field trip to another nonprofit across town, scheduled to last most of a workday. The plan was for a small group of us to carpool. At the last minute, 2 of our colleagues bailed. That left only me and Felix in his car for a nearly hour-long drive. We set out early, the sun just cresting over the city's skyline. For the first 15 minutes, we made small talk about the day's agenda, the new data system. But gradually, the tension wrapped around us, so palpable I felt every breath tighten. He asked softly, "Are you okay? You seem troubled." I blurted a half laugh, half sigh, admitting that I was torn between loyalty to my marriage and a yearning for something intangible that kept me awake at night. I didn't name him, but we both knew. Felix grew quiet, eyes fixed on the road. Then, at a red light, he turned to me, expression etched with empathy. "Marina, if you want me to back off, I will. I never meant to complicate your life." I stared at him, tears burning. "It's already complicated," I whispered. The light turned green, and we lurched forward. Silence smothered the car for the next few miles. We eventually arrived at the other nonprofit, navigating the day's workshops. I tried to focus on the presentations, taking notes, smiling politely. But my mind stuck on that moment in the car, the raw honesty of our exchange. On the drive back, we found ourselves alone again, the sky now overcast. About halfway, a sudden rainstorm erupted, drenching the streets. With the downpour, traffic slowed to a crawl. We found ourselves inching along a congested highway. Thunder rumbled. I felt my pulse pounding, as if nature mirrored the turmoil inside me. Without warning, Felix pulled off at an exit, saying he needed to wait out the worst of the storm. I didn't protest. We parked at a nearly empty gas station. Rain hammered the windshield. I heard the rhythmic squeak of wipers. We sat in tense silence, the windows fogging up. Then Felix exhaled, turned to me. "This can't keep going like this," he said. "I can't stand seeing you so torn, and I'm not the kind of man who takes lightly the idea of stepping into someone's marriage." He paused, voice quivering with sincerity. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something profound for you." I closed my eyes, tears escaping. My entire body trembled. "I don't want to hurt James," I said, voice cracking. "I never expected this, but I'm so unhappy. And you?" I trailed off, lost for words. We both knew the unsaid confession, that he'd become my refuge, a source of warmth I hadn't felt in years. He reached across the center console, gently took my hand. Rain pounded overhead, drowning the world outside. My breath caught at the simple contact, the quiet sense of inevitability. We leaned in, and our lips brushed. Once, softly, a hesitant question. Then a second time, deeper, a mutual acknowledgement that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. The roar of the storm outside matched the rush of blood in my ears. I felt the heat of his hand on my neck, the texture of his shirt under my fingers. It was as if the world shrank to that car, the torrential downpour, and us. After a few breathless moments, we broke apart, chests heaving. Fear, guilt, and overwhelming desire warred in my mind. Felix looked equally shaken. We didn't speak. The rain eventually eased, and he started the engine again. We drove the rest of the way in near silence, the air charged with what we'd done. I dreaded returning to my house that night, knowing I carried a truth I couldn't share. In the following days, we slipped into a clandestine pattern. We found excuses to work late or meet for lunches in out-of-the-way cafes. The emotional intimacy between us intensified, fueled by stolen kisses and soft confessions. Yet I felt a constant pang of guilt whenever I saw James, whose main crime seemed to be complacency. He wasn't cruel or dismissive, just absent in a way that left me starving for real connection. I realized how easily marriages could unravel, not from grand betrayals, but from slow neglect. I tried to muster the courage to talk to James, to say I was unfulfilled. Each time, the words died on my tongue. Meanwhile, Felix and I grew more entangled. We didn't leap into a full-blown affair in one night, but each boundary we crossed only made the next step easier. Sometimes, we'd share a few precious hours on a weekend under the guise of extra office work. Other times, he'd drive me home from a work event, and we'd linger in his car, hearts pounding. Eventually, James sensed something amiss. He confronted me one late evening after noticing my messages were locked with a passcode. I stumbled through an explanation. "They're just work chats, some private data for the nonprofit." I lied. He didn't fully believe me. Suspicion flickered in his gaze, replaced by heartbreak. But he said nothing else, retreating into the living room with a defeated slump of his shoulders. I stared after him, agony ripping at my chest. That night, I barely slept, torn between my vow to a man I once adored and the undeniable feelings for Felix. The final unraveling came after a staff retreat. Felix and I ended up alone in a scenic lodge, well after the official team-building activities ended. We'd each had a glass of wine, reluctant to part ways. Gazing at the tall pines outside, I felt a deep longing to break free from the charade. We talked in hushed tones about how we hated deceiving people, about how these secret moments felt both exhilarating and shameful. Felix gently asked if I might consider leaving James, or at least telling him the truth. My stomach twisted with fear. Could I end a marriage of 16 years for a man I'd known for only a few intense months? Then a text from James lit up my phone. "Where are you? It's late." My heart pounded. I typed a reply about still being at the lodge with coworkers, left out the detail that everyone else had gone. Felix watched me, tension etched on his face. He said softly, "I'm sorry to push, but I can't keep doing this indefinitely. You deserve to live honestly." That night, I drove home in a storm of tears and confusion. I found James awake, sitting in the kitchen. He looked up, saw my puffy eyes, and demanded to know what was going on. Anger flared in his voice, but beneath it lay desperation. I broke down. I admitted I was unhappy, that my heart was tangled up in something I didn't plan or expect. Though I didn't fully name Felix, I gave enough details that James pieced it together. He turned pale, tears pooling in his eyes. We argued, or rather, he shouted while I wept, trying to explain the emptiness that had led me to this. Eventually, he walked out the door, keys jangling, leaving me trembling on the kitchen floor, Tippy whimpering at my side. Over the next days, James moved in with a friend. I texted him, tried calling, offering to talk, but he mostly ignored me. Finally, we met in a public park to discuss logistics. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. I apologized profusely, admitting I should have talked to him long before letting these feelings for Felix flourish. He demanded to know if I was in love or just infatuated. I couldn't answer. The truth was, I didn't fully know. Only that with Felix, I felt a closeness and excitement I couldn't remember having with James for years. James decided he needed time. He told me he might file for separation, that he wasn't sure if our marriage could recover from this. I understood his pain all too well. We parted with tears in our eyes, both uncertain about the future. I returned to an empty house, phone buzzing with a worried text from Felix. Yet, at that moment, I felt too overwhelmed to respond. My entire world had collapsed. Weeks later, I'm living in a strange limbo. James remains distant, though occasionally we exchange messages about finances or Tippy's vet appointments. Felix and I still talk, but the guilt weighs heavily. We see each other in the office, keep interactions professional in public. In private, we share quiet confessions of how we never meant for this to turn so devastating. Sometimes we manage a brief, bittersweet embrace, though I sense his own heartbreak at watching me struggle with the ruins of my marriage. I can't say how it all will end. Maybe James and I can piece together a new version of our life, or maybe we'll part ways for good. Perhaps Felix and I will find a more open road, or maybe the burden of guilt and regret will overshadow what we've built. All I know is that ignoring the quiet fate of intimacy in my marriage led me here, stumbling into a bond that both awakened me and broke me. If someone reading this wonders how an ordinary life can unravel so fast, I can only warn, pay attention to the silences, the dull routines that hide longing. Speak up before it's too late. I'm Marina, and I never set out to betray the man I once believed was my soulmate. But life is messy, and longing can sneak up on you. Now I stand at a crossroads, uncertain which way leads to redemption. The house is quiet except for Tippy's gentle footsteps in the hall. I hold my phone, debating whether to call James or text Felix, or simply turn everything off and sit with my thoughts. For once, I can't rely on routines to guide me. Maybe that's a chance to discover who I really am, or maybe it's a path to further heartbreak. Only time will tell.